I think so, although I'm not sure if it's working at the moment. Can we get the, now it is. There we go. All right. Perfect. I'll turn it over to you.
Great, thanks, Jennifer. And yeah, we have that crazy frequency management style of two agencies in the U.S., but we work our way through it. So good morning again, everyone, and thanks to DSA for the kind invitation, and especially our fine host here in the Emirates. During the Work 23, the U.S. delegation had an extremely productive and delightful time here in Dubai. Under the leadership of our own Derek here, the Work 23 was very successful and proves that maintaining a consensus-driven approach in WRC matters is critical. While as per usual, during the Work 23, there was a lot of angst, uncertainty during the first part of that conference, as there is for any WRC. The cool and level-headed Tariq developed consensus on some tough agenda items, and I trust you had a great holiday after that. My talk today will focus on a couple items. No slides, just me up here. We'll be talking about the United States efforts on the IMT, 5G, 6G studies pursuant to the congressional legislation, and also be talking about the full 6 gigahertz unlicensed band. As many of you already know, the place where I work at, the National Telecommunications and Information Administration, NTIA, serves as the President's advisor on telecommunications matters. We also manage all the spectrum used by the federal government, from aviation to deep space communications to pretty much everything in between. It's never a dull moment. So this past summer, Congress enacted what they called the One Big Beautiful Bill Act, which we have shortened into OB3, which restored the Federal Communications Commission, FCC, Spectrum Auction Authority, and mandated the largest spectrum pipeline in American history. The One Beautiful Bill Act directed NTIA to identify 500 megahertz of spectrum to be auctioned off and reallocated for full power commercial license use. The FCC, the other side of the frequency regulatory side in the United States, is required to auction off an additional 300 megahertz, including at least 100 megahertz in the upper C-band. From a top level, what Congress is telling us that we need more mid-band 5G and ultimately 6G spectrum. Recall that the FCC licenses the U.S. carriers using what's called flexible use authority, meaning the license doesn't specify a certain standard, for example, a 3GPP standard. It focuses on the RF parameters such as rated power, out-of-band emissions, and bandwidth. So licensees can deploy 4G, 5G, and ultimately 6G services in these bands. The market drives the technology deployment of those licensees used by AT&T, Verizon, and T-Mobile. The first spectrum that will be deployed is the more 5G spectrum in the upper C-band. The U.S. is maximizing the 3 gigahertz band for 5G and ultimately 6G operations. This is excellent spectrum for commercial, high-powered wireless with favorable characteristics in propagation compared to other bands like 6 gigahertz. As you know, the higher you go in frequency, the propagation losses increase, making it more difficult to serve deep inside buildings with cellular signals. Though, as us spectrum experts know, in upper C-band, it's not going to be easy because that's adjacent to the radio altimeter band from 4.2 to 4.4 gigahertz. Altimeters are used by aircraft to determine its heights above ground level in critical flight operations, for example, during takeoff and landing. The U.S. stakeholders have already been working for several years with aviation safety groups such as the RTCA to develop the next generation of radio altimeters, which are able to tolerate high-powered adjacent 5G operations. While the standards are not yet quite done, we expect that 5G operations may be able to go all the way to 4.16 gigahertz. So the FCC will decide in the United States what that exact number is, but we are optimistic that we can extend 5G to somewhere between 4.1 to 4.16 gigahertz. This will take all new altimeters in commercial aircraft flying within and into the United States. Therefore, we will be jump-starting the radio altimeter supply chain to provide these new avionics, working with radio altimeter manufacturers and also aircraft manufacturers like Boeing and Airbus. This one-time, once-in-a-generation radio altimeter upgrade will allow other countries to take advantage of the enhancements of their own 5G deployment. This could pave the way for harmonized clearing in the upper C-band across the globe. So that's in the FCC lane. In the NTIA lane, we have to identify 500 megahertz of spectrum. We are looking at 3 bands as specified in the OB3, 7.125 to 7.4, 2.7 to 2.8 gigahertz, and the 4 gigahertz band. We are optimistic we can identify the full 500 megahertz from these bands. We expect to make progress on these bands within a year, and actually my boss would like to exceed that threshold by identifying more than 200 megahertz during this administration. The 7 gigahertz band in the United States has existing point-to-point microwave services, the Deep Space Network used by NASA, and military satellite communication systems. The 2.7 gigahertz band, the existing use cases there are aeronautical radar and weather radar observations, 2 very important use cases. For 4 gigahertz, there are many use cases used by federal agencies over a wide variety of services, so it's going to take us a wee bit longer to get our hands around that one. But for the purposes of studying, we'll be starting at the top of the band, 4.9 gigahertz, and working our way downward. Now going to the 6 gigahertz band. So if you've been noticing my discussion, I've been silent on the 6 gigahertz band. Congress did not include the 6 gigahertz band in the Pacific Spectrum bands mandated for repurposing studies in the Big Beautiful Bill Act. But then again, it did not explicitly rule out the band either, as it did with the lower 3 gigahertz and 7.4 to 7.8 gigahertz bands. This led to some speculation, and perhaps even some misinformation, that the U.S. is planning to repurpose some of the 6 gigahertz band for mobile broadband. My boss, Assistant Secretary Ariel Roth, has made clear recently at the America Spectrum Management Conference in D.C. the U.S. policy for the 6 gigahertz band remains unchanged. The band was designated for unlicensed use over 1,200 megahertz during the first Trump administration. That remains our position now. Maintaining Wi-Fi access in the upper 6 gigahertz band is essential for the future Wi-Fi technology in the United States. This spectrum is uniquely positioned to sustain the evolution of the Wi-Fi ecosystem and enable the next generation of digital innovation. This large continuous block of bandwidth at 6 gigahertz, which is relatively unencumbered with the older equipment that operates at 2.4 and 5 gigahertz, offers a wide runway for next generation Wi-Fi. Countries like China are allocating much of the band for high-powered 5G and 6G, knowing that this could undercut the development of the 6G equipment ecosystem and negate the strength of Wi-Fi and unlicensed broadband. But from a physics view, it is more challenging to implement as the propagation losses are much higher at the 6 gigahertz band, meaning more power is required at 6 gigahertz and the construction of more base stations for high-powered operations. As we're learning from this conference, the Wi-Fi bands carry the vast majority of the mobile data traffic, and having sufficient spectrum resources to carry that traffic is critical. The 6 gigahertz band also has the promise of many larger channel sizes, up to 320 megahertz. Countries not allocating the full 1,200 megahertz for unlicensed use will not be able to take advantage of these much larger channel sizes. This future-proofs the available spectrum to take advantage of the much larger channel sizes. And we will monitor how the AI and RF sensing applications are deployed and accepted. While the 6 gigahertz band is not on the agenda for the upcoming work, we will be vigilant in defending the band's critical role in powering global Wi-Fi technology. As I said earlier, one of the key bands we're looking at to make the Big Beautiful Bill mandate is a lower 7 gigahertz band. Because of our investment in the 6 gigahertz unlicensed band, one of the things we can look at during our study is the potential coexistence of unlicensed operations with licensed IMT operations in the small segment from 7.125 to 7.25 megahertz, which is adjacent to the 6 gigahertz band. This would allow up to 4 320 megahertz wide channels. You heard just a bit earlier, our friends in the UK, Ofcom, have already been studying the possible IMT and Wi-Fi coexistence and possible ways forward. Perhaps a sense and avoidance with engineering power levels for IMT operation could achieve this. I don't know. It's worth exploring, so let's take our time to assess it. This is where groups like the DSA and others are vital in exploring and discussing options about sharing. We look forward to hearing more from these groups about sharing opportunities. So in summary, here are the US terrestrial spectrum goals. Maximize the use of the 3 gigahertz band for 5G and ultimate 6G operations with the forthcoming upper C-band spectrum auction and with the next generation of radio altimeters. Study several bands at 2.7, lower 7 gigahertz, and 4 gigahertz for terrestrial IMT. And we look forward to evaluating technical studies with IMT and Wi-Fi coexisting in that small segment between 7.125 and 7.25 gigahertz. And I can't conclude the speech without discussing space. 2 important services are driving this in the United States, integrating between the terrestrial and satellite IMT networks in the handset level with the direct-to-device, and also supporting the low Earth orbit constellations for internet connectivity. All these services require spectrum, not only for the connection to the consumer devices, like the existing cellular bands for direct-to-device and the existing satellite Ka and Ku bands, but other bands for satellite gateways and TT&C. For TT&C, tracking, telemetry, and control, these are the signals that control the satellite. So we need additional spectrum for these commercial operations, as the S-band at 2 gigahertz is getting very congested. And for gateways, we are exploring new bands such as the E-band and even the W-band, which is 95 gigahertz and greater. While these bands are not heavily used today for terrestrial services, many of these segments in the band support weather observations, which are very important in the prediction of weather. The good news is compatibility between the services is possible. We just still have to figure it out. And also it's noting that we need to preserve Section 4.4 of the IT regulations. And why this is critical, because it allows us to experiment with new technologies, especially in the satellite sphere, that help to inform the eventual radio regulations that are needed to accommodate these services. Thank you for your time today.
Thank you, Coop.